We begin the day with a question about reporting from the White House. Is it a right or a privilege? It's a question a U.S. court is being asked to answer, and here is why. When Donald Trump moved back into the White House in January, one of his first acts was signing Executive Order number 14172, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. The Associated Press refused to follow suit, highlighting that the name change is only officially acknowledged within the United States. The rest of the world still calls it the Gulf of Mexico, and that is how it remains in the AP Style Guide. That's a book that is used by countless news outlets around the world. Well, as a result, the White House took the unprecedented step of banning the AP from covering all future White House events. The AP has sued. A decision is expected next week, but it will not change how the current president views his position and his relationship to the news media. DW's Washington Bureau Chief Enos Pohl takes us inside the White House tonight to find out what veteran White House correspondents think about their right, their privilege, and their duty.
I think we're all very concerned about any moves that would curtail this critical pillar of our democracy here.
The danger, the concern is that we're heading in a direction that's very worrisome.
We are at a time of exceptional tumult, exceptionally aggressive moves being taken by the executive.
Press freedom is under pressure in Trump's America. These are the voices of prominent American journalists. I'm sure you know this room from many movies. This, for example, is the podium from which the president himself sometimes delivers remarks. However, you know, this room looks much more glamorous in Hollywood productions than it does in real life.
Right next to the Oval Office it is, or at least was, a symbol of freedom of speech in this country. That feeling was shaken when Trump's spokesperson announced that agencies like the Associated Press would no longer have access to the Oval Office until they use the term Gulf of America.
If we feel that there are lies being pushed by outlets in this room, we are going to hold those lies accountable. And it is a fact that the body of water off the coast of Louisiana is called the Gulf of America.
She also said that from now on, influencers and new social media outlets would be granted access. How does this impact the work of traditional journalists?
I've had my hard pass, as we call it, my access to the White House for several years. In the past, it was automatic that, for instance, a foreign puller would be in the Oval Office listening to the exchanges. Now, from one day to the other, we're not sure. There's more uncertainty.
Peter Baker is the White House correspondent with the New York Times. He spent hundreds of hours in this room. Today, I reach him via Zoom.
My wife and I were in Russia during the beginning of Putin's era, and that's the first thing he did when he began to consolidate power, was to put pressure on the independent media to take over the one main independent television network, to make sure that people reported only what he wanted them to report and to ask him only the questions he wanted to be asked. And we're not there, obviously, at this point, but the danger, the concern is that we're heading in a direction that's very worrisome.
Brian Glenn wants to talk outside. He says the other journalists are not very friendly to him. He works with Real America's Voice, a conservative streaming channel. Glenn gained international attention when he asked President Zelensky why he wasn't wearing a suit in the Oval Office.
I think this is a refreshing new approach to letting the American people see all sides of the story. And even with the addition of me being in the room, it's a privilege to work in the White House, in the briefing room, to travel on Air Force One. It's not a right.
But it's not only the change within the White House press pool that's concerning. The major cuts at America's international broadcasting state media network, Voice of America, also underline Donald Trump's understanding of free media.
The idea that taxpayer money, that government money, would go to support a news outlet that is seeking to provide verifiable and independent reporting with its own editorial judgment is an affront to the idea that somehow he controls every message. He'd control every news cycle. He'd control every editorial judgment.
How should journalists adapt to this new world order?
Is a time when I think journalistic rigor, fairness, but muscular attention is perhaps most needed for our audiences and for the health of our democracy.
All right, I want to stay now with the Washington reporting crew. I'm joined by our Washington Bureau Chief, Ines Pohl. She filed that report. She's currently reporting out in the field in Las Vegas for us today. Ines, you have been reporting from Washington for years, for as long as we've known each other. How much has changed under this current administration?
Right, Brent. Remember, we reported about the first Trump election in 2015. The mood has dramatically changed, also within the journalistic world or the journalists. You know, it's people are more scared to be outspoken. I'm here actually at a Bernie event. You see the lines behind me. I was also talking with people about that, and this is just echoing what we also experience, kind of within the White House pool. People are really worried that if they are outspoken against Donald Trump, that this might really backfire. I would say that journalists in Washington and around this country still are doing their job, but we slightly see a beginning of, let's put it, a self-censorship. They really double ask themselves, is it really necessary to say what I'm saying? Is it really necessary to be so explicit in my critique about the sitting president? So the mood is slowly changing.
Yeah, I mean, do you see President Trump having any success in trying to shape the press so that it's in compliance with his personal views? I mean, is he succeeding in getting his message and only his message reported?
Well, you know, he's changing the access to, for example, the Oval Office, or when he's traveling with Air Force One, less and less of the kind of traditional media are allowed to be always close to him. He's like cherry picking the people whom he knows. Are reporting the way he wants them to report. Like, example, he is allowing people to ask him questions who will just praise his actions. So yes, he is successful. And also, like in the newspaper world, we know that Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, has changed the editorial pages. So yeah, it's slowly sinking in.
Yeah, we're definitely noticing a change in the questions that are coming from the White House press corps, that's for sure. Our Washington Bureau Chief, Ines Pohl. Ines, as always, we appreciate your reporting. Thank you. And our coverage continues now with Rebecca Hamilton. She's the executive editor of the digital law and policy journal Just Security. She's also a professor of law at American University in Washington. So, Professor, it's good to have you with us this evening. Let me just start by asking you, is there anything illegal in the way the Trump White House, the Trump administration, is treating the news media at the moment?
That is literally under litigation right now. So certainly there is, in relation to what has happened in terms of the Trump administration's treatment of the Associated Press, that is a live issue before the district court in the District of Columbia, whether their First Amendment rights have been infringed by the action that's been taken against them. But I think what is really important to understand is that no matter how that plays out, we have had by the Trump administration a complete breaking through of all of the norms that have been in place for many years in terms of the relationship between the government and the free press.
Let me ask you just your thoughts on the White House press pool. You know that a judge recently ruled that access is a privilege and not a right. What are your thoughts on that?
So the question of privilege versus right is sort of less important than understanding that once you have opened the presidency to the press, then you can't discriminate against one particular member of the press on the basis of how they are choosing to report, right? Because then you run into a First Amendment violation. So the question is, once you have opened the presidency to the press, as we have historically and is continuing to be done, and for good reason, are you then excluding them for some illegal reason, such as, and this is the claim in the Associated Press case, that they are not following what the president has determined to be now the Gulf of America and historically the Gulf of Mexico in all of your reporting. I think it's really important to also note that the Associated Press acknowledges that President Trump has made this order of changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America in its reporting. It is just saying that as a global news organization, it would be confusing to so many of our audiences around the world to start just referring to this as the Gulf of America. By contrast, when there's a name change that is happening solely inside of the United States, as has happened with President Trump has changed the name of Mount Denali to Mount Kinley, then they are following that because that is what makes sense for their news reading public.
Could journalists argue that the president is saying that it's a right, it's not a right to be able to report from inside the White House, it's a privilege? He's using that argument because he wants to select the people who he knows will give him positive reporting. I mean, he's trying, you could say, go around his elbow to get to his thumb in order to get good PR for his administration. Would that be an argument that journalists could use?
So that is, I think, an accurate accounting of what is happening. And this is playing out at two levels, right? So it is, one, what is he doing that might be illegal here? And this is the question of whether AP has been excluded in a way that violates their First Amendment rights. But the second question is, apart from that issue of legality, just what do we as US citizens consider the merit of having a system where a president can exclude sources based on whether they're giving him favorable coverage or not?
The Donald Trump issue, that's one thing. I'm wondering, though, is the president, is he exacerbating a tendency to self-censorship that we're seeing among reporters, a self-censorship that is caused by an increasing concentration of media ownership in fewer hands? Do you think that is playing a role in all of this?
Absolutely. I think we can't understand at the moment that we're in terms of media freedom in the United States without also understanding that incredible concentration that has been happening over time of the media. And we're seeing that playing out, obviously, in the Washington Post, now owned by Amazon owner Jeff Bezos. And that is the site where we're seeing self-censorship taking hold sort of most quickly. But again, putting this in context, this is coming from a president who is very willing to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to really denigrate and threaten journalists for just free reporting. And as soon as you are using that incredible state power to threaten journalists for their reporting, then that puts the risk of censorship into the system.
I wanted to pick up on that. We get reports daily now. Trump bashes CNN correspondent. Today, it's Trump slams a Fox reporter. I mean, what do you make of Trump's vindictive treatment of journalists that he deems to have crossed him?
I think it reflects President Trump's long-standing approach to journalism in general, which is that he loves the media when it supports what he is saying, but he sees it not as a tool to inform freely and fairly the public, but as a PR tool to support his own agenda. And so that's why you see him being very friendly and collegial with journalists who he thinks are aligning with his message, but quite the opposite anytime a journalist reports unfavorably on what he media is doing. But again, it just sort of reflects this idea that journalists aren't there to freely and fairly inform the public. They're there to serve as his PR machine.
Yeah, that's right. He likes you until he doesn't like you. Professor Rebecca Hamilton joining us from Washington. Professor, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, for more now, I'm joined by Jodie Ginsberg. She's CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and she joins us from New York. Jodie, it's good to see you. Let me start by what we're seeing in the courts right now. What's your assessment of the legal battle right now between the Associated Press and the Trump administration?
Well, we had expected the AP to be in court today. That's actually been pushed forward to next week. They are arguing that they should be allowed back into the White House press pool. And a judge has already said that he believes that what the White House has done is what's called viewpoint discrimination. In other words, the government is punishing the Associated Press for having the temerity to continue to call the Gulf of Mexico, something it's been called for 400 years, the Gulf of America, which is the change that Donald Trump made in one of his early executive orders.
What do you make of what we're hearing from President Trump, that reporting from the White House, reporting from Air Force One, he says it's not a right, but rather a privilege?
Well, of course, nobody has a right to report on the government or a right to report on anything else, but it is a fundamental principle to democracy that news outlets should be able to report, journalists should be able to report without government interference or coercion. It's important to remember about the Associated Press. It's one of the key, what we call news agencies. So it is an independent news organization that reports out, and many other news outlets buy its content to provide information to their readers and listeners. And that's certainly true across the United States, where news outlets serving both Republican and Democratic listeners and readers will be getting AP content to provide to their listeners. And so the AP, like organizations like Reuters and others, provides a really essential service. And without them able to report freely on the White House, you're denying millions of Americans the ability to understand what is happening inside and what is being said inside the White House.
The CPJ has criticized the funding cuts that we have seen to organizations such as the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. How do you think these cutbacks, how are they going to impact press freedom globally, beyond the borders of the United States?
We've had a couple of things happen since the Trump administration came into power. We've had the US AID cuts. The US was one of the biggest funder of independent media worldwide. Remember that in many countries around the world, people don't have access to free and independent information from their own government because independent media is either severely curtailed or in some cases banned. And so they're reliant on independent media organizations that have to seek funding outside for their information. So that's the first restriction. And then, of course, at the weekend, we saw the shutting down of Voice of America. Again, a news outlet on which millions of people, more than 300 million people a week, listen to Voice of America or watch Voice of America broadcast for information about their countries that their own governments would restrict from them. It's like Deutsche Welle or the BBC or others providing information not just to their own citizens about those countries, but crucially providing information, independent information, where none else is available. And so it's a huge blow to press freedom, the closure of Voice of America and the threatened closure of Radio Free Europe, and also a risk to those journalists who have been reporting for those outlets.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you have a lot of colleagues who are now unemployed as a result as well. Jodie Ginsberg with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jodie, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. And of course, we appreciate your work. Thank you.